Hi, welcome to Ask Tim, the insurance technical podcast brought to you by IABNY. I'm your host, Tim Dodge, and I'm coming to you today from the Copy Center here in the Geek Cave, deep within the fortress-like confines of IABNY headquarters in DeWitt, New York. What I want to talk to you about today is, if you watched our previous episode, it was about how to identify an independent contractor in the construction industry. We talked about the New York Construction Industry Fair Play Act and what the law says about whether someone is an employee of a contractor or an independent contractor, somebody who is a separate business entity. Well, now I want to talk to you today about how you identify such a person in a non-construction environment. When one of my first jobs out of college, I worked in the mailroom of a particular company, and I guess when they hired me, I was a temporary employee, and when they hired me, I guess I was told that I was an independent contractor. It didn't really sink in. I was in my early 20s. And so I didn't really think about it until the next year when I did my income tax return and found myself paying self-employment tax on the money I made as a temp. Came as something of a surprise. And really what I was doing was I was making copies, like stuff like this alert here. And I was told when to make the copies. I was given a copier to work with. I was told when to be to work, when to go to lunch, and when what time I could go home, and all this sort of stuff. And I got to tell you, when I talked to my dad, he's still doing a slow burn about this, about how they called me an independent contractor, about how angry that makes him. I'm like, Dad, I was 23 at the time. It was 6 years ago. So you got to let this go, just like you got to let go of that copy work. But anyway. The thing is, I was not an independent contractor. I was an employee. My dad's justifiably not pleased about this. Frankly, when I wrote the check for my income taxes, I wasn't too pleased either. But that was a long time ago. But let's talk about, because I do get questions from IABNY members about whether somebody is an independent contractor or not. I'll bet not a week goes by that I don't get a phone call or an email from a member saying, I've got a client who's paying somebody on a 1099 basis. And they want to know how this affects the workers' comp, how this affects the general liability rating. And I said, well, not so fast. Because the mere fact that you're paying somebody as a 1099 does not mean that they're not an employee. In fact, if you go to the New York Workers' Compensation Board's website, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes that accompany this podcast, there's a list of 10 criteria there that the Workers' Comp Board looks at when somebody gets hurt to determine whether or not that person is an employee. So if you've got a situation where the employer is saying this person was not an employee, they were an independent contractor, and that person is saying, oh yes, I was too an employee and I want workers' comp benefits, the Workers' Comp Board has to decide who's right. And they've got a list of 10 criteria that they look at to determine whether somebody was an independent contractor or whether they were an employee. So, for example, and some of these, again, if you watch the last episode of the podcast, some of these will sound a bit familiar. But in the opinion of the Workers' Comp Board, and I think these are some of the same criteria that the Federal Internal Revenue Service uses, an independent contractor meets some or all of the following criteria. Number one, an independent contractor controls the time and the manner in which the work is to be done. So if you're telling somebody what time they have to be to work, if you're telling them how to do the copy work, that means they're probably an employee, not an independent contractor. Number two, the independent contractor obtains his or her own federal employer's identification number or files self-employment tax returns with the IRS come tax time. Number three, an independent contractor maintains a separate business establishment separate from that of the hiring business. So if you hire somebody who has their own office or has their own shop, has their own photography studio or something like that, yeah, that person may very well be an independent contractor and not one of your employees. Number four, the person doing the work does different work than the primary operation of the hiring business. In my case, I was making copies in an office. Office is kind of a normal part of the operation. Some of you are probably making copies right now rather than listening to me. But that said, somebody who does something different, you hire up. IABNY hires somebody to paint the walls in the office, and frankly, the Geek Cave here could use a touch-up. Or you hire a photographer, or somebody, or a consultant of some kind. That person might be an independent contractor because they do something different than the hiring business does. Number 5, the person doing the work is operating under a specific contract. Is responsible for satisfactory performance of the work. Well, usually an employee would be too. But going beyond that, the independent contractor stands to either profit or lose money from their performance on the job for the specific work under the contract. An independent contractor will obtain their own liability insurance policy and, if necessary, their own workers' compensation or disability insurance policies, depending on whether or not that person has employees. An independent contractor has recurring business obligations and liabilities. Bills that come in every month, payroll, taxes, insurance, rental of equipment, whatever, rent on a separate business establishment, as I was talking about before. So an independent contractor has those things going on. Somebody making copies in an office? Probably not. The independent contractor has his own business cards, does its own advertising, does its own promotion of his or her own services. An employee generally isn't going to have those things. I have, as an employee of IABNY, I have IABNY business cards. IABNY paid for those. I didn't obtain them on my own. So that makes me an employee. I didn't provide my own advertising. The independent contractor provides all the necessary tools and equipment to do the job. When I was making copies, the company I worked for provided the copier, whereas somebody doing construction, well, that's not a good example, but somebody doing consulting work maybe provides their own laptop, maybe provides their own software. What other equipment? Maybe they're a trainer. Maybe they do off-site training and they provide their own projector for displaying PowerPoint slideshows. Whatever. An independent contractor provides all those things him or herself, whereas the employee is going to have those things provided for them by the hiring business. And lastly, an independent contractor operates under his or her own operating permit, authority, or license. For example, an insurance broker who's in business for himself goes out and obtains his own license. Somebody working in an insurance agency, the agency might pick up the cost of the license. Somebody who's working independently probably pay their own licensing fees. That's a very simple example. And of course, there are separate sections of the workers' comp law that pertain to insurance agents and brokers to determine whether or not they're independent contractors. But the principle is the same. If somebody's an independent contractor, they get their own permits, they get their own licenses and so on. If they're an employee, it's usually the employer who's taking care of all those things for them. If you need more information about this or anything else related to workers' compensation, take a look at the workers' compensation page in the research section of the IABNY website. You'll find a lot of information there, links to laws, links to the Workers' Comp Board's website, latest loss cost multipliers, latest schedule of loss costs, all that stuff. So I encourage you to take a look there. If you need to get in touch with me, I'm at 800-851-8853, extension 229. You can fax me at 888-432-0510. Drop me an email at tdodge@iabny.org. You can find me on AOL Instant Messenger as tdog4494, and you can harass me on Twitter as AskTim. And if you see me out and about at a trade show or at a meeting, or if I'm teaching a class or something like that, don't be afraid to come on up and ask me a question. Lots of IABNY members do it, and I welcome the opportunity to meet you all and answer your questions in person. Thanks for watching this episode of Ask Tim. And remember, if you are looking for copy work to be done, and I got lots of it here, don't forget to ask Tim.